All right, well, hello everyone. It's time to get going with our class tonight. We're looking, hopefully, at as much of Exodus 23 and 24 as we can. I think I'm just going to start every class with that tagline, because that's really is the goal. Let's get as much of it in front of us as we can, and then go from there. Before we start, let's offer a word of prayer. Our God and our Father, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you for the ability you gave each one of us to be able to learn from your text, to live in this country where we were educated to the point where we could read and understand and study, where we could have opportunity to be with our fellow saints in peace and in comfort. Father, help us to not take this opportunity lightly and to spend it wisely, looking through your word and drawing from it the things you left there. And not just that, but taking it to the world around us that's sorely in need of what's written there. Father, thank you for this opportunity. We beg you, Father, to forgive us of our sins. Help us as we try to serve each other better and to serve you more faithfully. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Here's a quote from Mike. I mentioned Stewart's commentary. You probably saw this line. I love it. It's one of the better summaries I've ever seen for the law. In Stewart's commentary on Exodus, this is later in the book, he says, all Old Testament law is promise and warning. When we read through, you might say, the legal codes, there are some here and there are some later in the law, and some after that even. It's not just don't do this, don't do this. They are promises of, in a sense, this is what you have to do to be blessed. And they are warnings about, well, if you violate these things, this is how bad things happen to you, right? It's a kind of a very general summary, but I love that idea. All of the law is promise and warning. Here's the section of the text we're still working through, 20 to 23 in the book of Exodus. I call this just the terms of the covenant. We're in the second part of this, and then the way our study kind of happened, we have to throw in chapter 24, because chapter 24 is sort of not legal code, and it's not blueprints. It's sort of a chapter in between subjects. It is a very, very important chapter because the people of Israel, kind of through Aaron and Moses and these elders of Israel, are going to officially enter covenant with God. There is the reading of the law, there is sprinkling with blood, there's a covenant meal that happens on Mount Sinai, there's the very curious version of they got to see God, and we're going to talk about that hopefully. Excuse me. And then in 25 we go into some blueprints. But I don't want to say anymore, I want to give you your shot. Your shot. All right? 23 and 24, what things stuck out to you? What did you notice? What did you like when you read through? All right, one at a time, please. All right, Bob, you're first.
I think one of the interesting things that I found, and I always find it interesting, is that when God gives them these instructions like, you'll farm the field for 6 years and leave it fallow, 7, or you'll work 6 days and you'll take 7 off, or your beast can rest, and so on. All these instructions are, if you really think about it, healthy for the Israelites and their people. They're actually in their best interest to do these things, even though God's saying you're doing it because I tell you to do it. Does that make sense?
They're not just, is it capricious the word? There's just,
right,
for whatever reason.
arbitrary and capricious.
That's the word, arbitrary.
Yeah.
They're not.
No.
This is how successful societies and cultures work around the world.
It's a built-in value to them. I guess it's fascinating to me because obviously God in His infinite wisdom knows, but hidden in there is this is the best way to do it. And if you really look at the techniques even they use today, you'll find the same kind of thing.
Absolutely, same principles apply. Derek, you got one?
I guess one thing that I hadn't noticed before is where Moses halves the blood before the offering. And just think of that, of the covenant. Both parties are vested into it. The blood on the altar that seals God's side of His promise. The blood on the people for sealing their covenant. And then you think ahead of a connection to Christ in that the blood on the cross that sealed His promises, and then we come into contact with the blood in baptism that seals our commitment.
Absolutely.
Tie-in.
I love you noticed that point about where the blood went. Because it's kind of impossible to put the blood all over Mount Sinai. or in any real sense to put it on God like you put it on the people. So what's the next best thing? It's put it on the place where he's being worshipped at by sacrifice. Now that blood on the altar, of course, is going to be done continually from almost from here on out. But yeah, both parties have a stake in this. It sort of reminds you of the scene in Genesis where Abraham parts the animals, right? There's sort of there's a dual version of that. Maybe a small connection there, but yeah. Julian and then Mike.
Of all the things that he could mention, he mentioned not to boil a young colt in his mother's milk.
Yes. I think the thought there, that came from Canaanite idolatry. If I understand, now there is a lot of sort of debate because it's sort of a curious line, but if I understand it correctly, this is something Canaanites would do. The idea being if you boil the young goat while it's still drinking the milk from the mother, there's some kind of transfer. It's a really sort of interesting way of kind of thinking through that. But what helps with that, if you look down in the text, look at chapter 23, what other laws come near it? That's one way you can the laws are not just willy-nilly thrown together. They're often by category. So the three laws there at the end of, no, it's not the end of 20, it's not the end of 23, it's 18 and 19. There's three laws there, but what do they all have to do with? Right? There's a law against not offering blood of the sacrifice with leaven, and with that, letting the fat remain till morning. There's a law about offering the best of your first fruits, and then there's this law about not boiling the goat. The first two have to do with worship, right? And we've seen this before already in this section of Exodus, trilogies, right? A group of three things that all have something in common, and I think this is another one of those. That tells me that whatever this last one is, it has to do with sacrifice and worship. Does that make sense? Now, what it all came from is maybe even lost to history, but that at least tells me what it's about. It had to do with worship. Mike, do you have a comment?
Yeah, on that one, I've always struggled with that as well. But in what has happened in Jewish practice is you don't eat hamburger with cheese.
Right, right.
That's the kosher practice.
No milk and meat together.
Meat,
No cheeseburgers.
yeah.
Can't do that.
Other things, like if you're eating bacon for breakfast, you can't have coffee with milk
Right.
when you travel.
So they've taken this and kind of extrapolated it to
Yes.
their meals, right?
Now, back to the first question, you were talking about what did you see? In the first part, verses 1 through 5, there's or 1 through 3, there's a real emphasis on justice. You find it picked up in 6 again,
Mm-hmm.
that in our legal system, we need to be sure that we have the strict application of justice. And where you have that compromised, you really got a major problem. There's also some where that Jesus said, love your enemy. When you look at the law in verse 4, if your enemy's ox or donkey is going astray, you shall bring it back to him.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be easy to just walk on by that
Right.
and take no interest in it, or if the donkey's had too much laid on it, that he lays down under the load he's carrying, you'll help get it off for
Right.
him. And you have that same kind of love for them as well when you have in verse 10, the welfare of the poor. The poor need to have food as well. So you don't oppress a stranger, verse 9. The love for the enemy is, love for others is paramount in all
Yeah.
those statements that are there.
You're absolutely right. It's like as if they all boil down to love your neighbor, whoever that is. And they do, and that's, I think, part of the point. I don't know if I put this in the notes or not. Some have suggested that from verses 1 through 8, there's a bit of a chiasm of topics. It's because, let me see, the section from 1 to 8 in chapter 23 begins with a false report and a malicious witness. It ends with, you shall take no bribe, for bribe blinds the clear-sighted, so sort of miscarriages of justice there. There is not falling in with the many to do evil, and then keeping far from a false charge, and don't kill the innocent, and that so on. You see 2 laws about being partial to the poor, right? You don't be partial to a poor man, and you don't pervert justice to the poor. And then in the middle is that section Mike was talking about with if you see your enemy's ox. Okay, so it all sort of kind of gathers around that central thing. Even if it's your enemy, you do what's right by him. Absolutely. All right, one more. All right, one of you two. Y'all have to rock, paper, scissors.
I thought it was interesting, especially there in the first couple of verses. You're dealing with laws for a nation, but they're very personal.
Yes.
The idea in verse 2 is at some point the many are going to do it wrong. You don't.
Mm-hmm.
Almost that foreshadowing of what we're going to see through the rest of the Old Testament with the Jewish nation. Doesn't matter what they do, you do what's right.
Right. I'm glad you noticed that this does seem to be on the individual, like the personal level. This whole section of laws is that way. The Ten Commandments are that way, right? You don't do this. And everything's at the individual level. We're not talking about now they will get to as a nation pretty soon, right? There will be laws, you go through Leviticus, that's national sort of worship laws. You got a priesthood, that's a national kind of thing. Later in Deuteronomy, we're going to talk about kings and so on. But at this stage, it's just, okay, you're an Israelite, here's how to do that. Here's the way you treat folks. Here's the way you regard sacrifice. Here's what you do for... It's very personal, okay, and that's a good thing to notice. When it comes to justice, and especially in that first bit of chapter 23, truth is the only thing that matters, right? It's not about falling in, what did I say? It's not about joining hands with the wicked to be a malicious witness. You're not, there's no corruption involved in that. You shall not fall in with the many. This wasn't a democratic system of justice where if most of you thought it was right, it was right. Don't fall in with the many to do wicked. Doesn't matter if it's many. It's not right. It's not just. You don't pity a poor man because he's poor, and you don't withhold justice from a poor man because he's poor. Right? Economic status didn't matter or shouldn't have mattered. You're not allowed to bribe people. You're not allowed to get out of over and over and over again what's true and what's just. That is the only standard that was supposed to have been implemented. You saw the line about not oppressing sojourners. We saw that in the last section. Okay, and it's almost word for word. For you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. In fact, I think it is word for word. In 22 verse 21 and in 23 verse 9. When you get into the latter bit of 23, I like this. I guess my first thing reading through this again, I always knew, because the Sabbath ordinance is in the Ten Commandments, right? And that's given in Exodus 20. There's a Sabbath law, and then the reason for that in Exodus 20 is because God spent 6 days in creation and rested on the Sabbath. So that's why you're going to observe Sabbath. You go over to Deuteronomy 5, you got a different reason given in that text. Same law, but the reason in Deuteronomy 5 is you were a slave in Egypt, and God delivered you from Egyptian bondage. That's the point of this thing. I never caught that Exodus 23 had a third reason. If you think about it, that's kind of neat. There are 3 main Sabbath laws, and there are 3 reasons given for why you observe Sabbath. What's different in this section from the first and the third one? What's the reason given here in our text for why they were to observe Sabbath? It doesn't mean they're not honoring creation. It doesn't mean they're not remembering the Exodus. But what's the thing here that's focused on? Bob?
The rest of the animals.
Rest for the animals? Who else?
Slaves.
The slaves? It's so that the poor can eat? What else? There's another couple. The land gets to rest, which is the land being personified is kind of interesting, right? And then at the very tail end of that, and the alien or the sojourner, whoever, may be refreshed. He saw what's happening. You have this reason here for observing Sabbath that isn't about creation and it isn't about the Exodus. It's about just taking a break for everybody, and I love that. Anytime going forward I teach anything about the Sabbath, I am going to say those 3 things again. So write it down. Okay, it's gonna come up. 3 reasons for Sabbath. It comes from the text. Mike, did you have a thought?
I had, not on that, were you through with your point there?
With that one, yeah, go for it.
Okay. There are 3 places in this book, chapter rather. Verse 13, pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods,
Right.
or let it be heard on your lips. And then in verse 23 and 24, he's talking again about don't be guilty of worshiping the gods of the idols. And if you go down to verse 32, you shall make no covenant with them or with their gods.
Mhm.
Well, if everybody's religion is all equal, what
Yep.
difference does it make?
Yep. It wasn't true. Oh, it isn't
They're
true.
an ecumenist.
Yeah. God wasn't inclusive.
No.
He wasn't, well, no, he says, don't even talk about them. In our vernacular, we have a phrase, keep my name out of your mouth, right? This is the Israelite version. God's saying, keep their name out of your mouth. Don't even talk about them. Okay? Don't even acknowledge them, which is amazing. I mean, when you really think about it. All right. We have here also listed your big 3 in terms of Israelite feasts. The 3 times a year that they were to, all the males had to present themselves. One is the Passover, which we already talked about in chapter 13. One is the Feast of Weeks. Of course, how many weeks after Passover was this? 50 days, right? It's where Pentecost comes from that idea of 50 days later. Roughly 7 weeks in a day, I guess. And then the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, or it might be called the Ingathering too. All 3 names are used. It's the same feast. Okay, so whichever one that is, you can go from there. Like I said, this is required for all Israelites yearly. You see this mentioned here. When you get to chapter 34, and there's sort of the reiteration of the terms of the covenant after the golden calf incident in 32. Of course, God's going to kind of go through some of this law stuff again, and he's going to repeat that there, and then you're going to see it repeated in Deuteronomy as well. This was the point Mike was mentioning. Pay attention to all I've said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. He is completely disinterested with these gods, and he wants Israel to be the same way. There is no place for even talking about it. The world religions class in ancient Judaism would have been real boring because they didn't talk about it, or they weren't supposed to. Okay, 23 and verse 19, Monsters, Inc. reference if you know that movie. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. That is repeated all over the place, throughout the law and even a few times afterwards. It just made me wonder if, again, the text of Genesis 4 doesn't say, but it makes you wonder. Because you remember there's the contrast between Abel brought the best of his flock and the fat, and then Cain brought fruit of the ground. So God did accept the fruit of the ground for some offerings. We see that here. Did he accept it in Genesis 4? I don't know. Was this the thing Cain broke? I don't know. But I find it an interesting connection. God did accept some version of what Cain brought later with Israel, so long as it was the best. Okay, so just for what it's worth. Go to 23 and look at 20 through 33 again. We haven't really talked so much through this section. God says he is going to send what or who for Israel? An angel. What is fascinating when you read through this text, who's doing the delivering to Egypt, or the delivering from or to the land of Canaan, and who's defeating the enemies? Because the text alternates, not strictly, but it goes back and forth between God either saying, I'm going to do it, or he's going to do it. What's even better, the text describes the angel doing things and being able to do things that only God is said to be able to do. So it's curious, sort of the way this is written. It's a very, very interesting section. One thing I will tell you, if you go through here and you read, what was Israel supposed to do? What was to be their response to this angel or to God?
Listen carefully.
Pay careful attention to him, obey his voice, right, is the first one. Next one, if you carefully obey his voice and do all I say, Isn't that interesting? If you obey his voice, do all I say. Again, and a little later, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God. Right? The main thing was listen to him. Do as he says. Right? The most basic sort of requirements. Israel says a couple of times in this section some version of whatever the Lord says we will do. Now they throw in an extra line in the second one, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. Kind of a repetition of the thing. But they do this a couple of times. In 24 and verse 4, is this the first record in the Bible of inspired scripture? I don't know, maybe. It's a neat thought, right? 24 and verse 4, what happens? Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Is this the first instance? I don't know, perhaps. What strikes me, nobody has talked about the thing at the end of the chapter, which is fascinating. It's almost like we didn't get to chapter 12. I won't say that. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, who we remember because they get incinerated later, but at this point they're fine. Those 4 guys and 70 Israelite elders go up the mountain, have dinner with God in essence, have a meal before Him. Would they bring a table or a blanket? I don't know. Was it a picnic? I don't know. What they eat? I have no idea. They go up, the text says, they saw the God of Israel. What's the only thing they can say about Him? Or at least that survives and makes it into the text of the Bible. The only thing they can talk about is what was under His feet. We have this sometimes maybe a fun sort of thought experiment where we think, well, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God this, or, I wish He were here. These guys had their opportunity, and the only thing it seems that they came back with was, we saw what the ground under His feet looked like. Our conception of God isn't big enough yet, right? Our understanding of His power and glory and all of those things. And even that still required God not to kill him. It wasn't, hey, we looked God in the face and He decided not to kill us. It's, we went up, had dinner up there, and we saw the ground under His feet, but He didn't lay His hand on us and kill us. Or, I'm sorry, He did not, let me say this right. What does it say there? He did not lay His hand on the chief men of Israel. That's right. He didn't kill us for being up there. Was God malicious? No. But again, you're dealing with a very, very intensely powerful entity. So much so that He has to make sure you don't die when you're near Him. Does that make sense? That's astounding. That's like saying, you flew too close to the sun and the sun decided you wouldn't die that day. That'd be the nearest analog to it, and that's not even close. Okay, what did it mean to them? I'm going to put these all up here at once for time's sake. Because a few of these are repetitions from the last section. Okay, this isn't the first time in our law section that we talked about justice and doing the right thing. This has been mentioned before. It gets mentioned here seriously. The same way last week that if God cares about the vulnerable people, then maybe I should too. By maybe I mean I definitely should. Same thing here. If God is so wrapped up in justice and truth and the right thing being done, then you as an Israelite, that just became one of your priorities. And it's not about how much money you have or don't have, and it's not about how many people think you're guilty or don't think you're guilty. Truth was the only thing that's supposed to matter, and justice. Okay, so your priorities, your way of thinking about things is changing as an Israelite. Bob, was you the one who said earlier that the laws were given for their benefit?
Yes.
The worship was given for their benefit. You might say, well, they had to give all these sacrifices. This was for their good. This was for their they were better off because of this. Taking Sabbath days. Well, the Lord won't let us work one day a week. Can you imagine telling a slave culture, look, you get one day to not do anything. In fact, I want you to not do anything. Oh, and by the way, once every 7 years, you're going to take the whole year and not do anything. It's like, there's a reason why the Greeks, when the Greek Empire conquered the land of Palestine, they thought all the Jews lazy because they took Saturday off. Right? This is unheard of. It's astounding, and it's for their own good. What else was I going to say? Nothing. All right. I'm going to skip straight to the end because I like this part. We'll go back to the application stuff, I promise, but we're going to do this first.
Before you go too far,
Before I go too far. See, I tried.
in verse 14, I think it's fascinating, 24, when he has the elders there and he's going to take Moses up,
Yes.
he says to the elders, wait here for us until we return to you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them. Do you find that sad that God has these elders so close, and he's going to be gone for a little bit? He has to remind them, if you guys get in a scuffle, these two will settle it. Don't you find that sad?
It didn't strike me that way. It struck me as just sort of like a contingency, right? We're going to be up here for a while. If something happens,
Okay.
because Moses, he's already had his conversation with Jethro, so he should have already farmed out a lot of this decision making. But he still stood at the top of the food chain there. So while he's up there, someone's got to be, someone's got to be watching the ship, you might
Somebody's got to be
say.
in charge.
Now, you mentioned Aaron and Hur. We've heard their names before in Exodus. Who are they?
Held Moses' hand.
They're the guy that held Moses' hands while Israel fought Amalek, right? And the longer when they held the hands up, they won, and when the hands fell down, they lost, right? Same two guys. So pretty cool. You see their names come up again here. All right, let's talk about Jesus for a while. I want to get back to application. I'm going to do this one first just because there's a few of them, and I want to make sure we get through those. Okay. Come back to the angel in 23, the last half of 23. Can you think of anybody else in the Bible that could be rightly described the way this angel is described? Someone who would destroy the enemies, that would bless you, someone that would bring them to the land of promise, someone they had to listen to and make sure they obey his word, somebody that had the ability to not pardon their transgressions if he saw fit. What does that sound like? Sounds like Jesus. Sounds at least like the way he was described and the way he is the things he had the ability to do. Now, I wavered back and forth between two opinions, so I just put them both up there. Okay. At worst, or at least you might say, this points forward to who Jesus would be. At the very least, this points forward to who Jesus would be. Some would go so far as to argue and say, this is Jesus. I don't know. The text doesn't make it clear. What is curious to me about the section is, like we mentioned a moment ago, the back and forth between what he will do and what I will do when God is speaking to them. And when you listen to him, you're listening to me, and he had the ability to take away sins or not take away sins. That, to me, points at Jesus if it doesn't point directly to him. Does that make sense? Is that clear as mud? Did I butcher that? Okay. At the very least, you're thinking about somebody that's at least appears somewhat like Jesus would be. Plus, there's that curious reference in 1 Corinthians 10. Remember the one, verses 3 and 4? The rock that followed them in the wilderness. They ate from the Spirit and they drank from the spiritual rock, and the rock was Christ, verse 4. Is this it? I don't know, but it's awful compelling to think through it. Okay, time for compare and contrast. In the text, Moses is called into God's presence temporarily for Israel's sake. He didn't get to spend all day there. He spent quite a while there, but this wasn't somewhere he just stayed, right? He went in for a purpose and then came back down to the people. Jesus did the opposite. Where did Jesus start? Start his existence is the wrong way to put that. Where was Jesus before he came here? He was with God. And then what happened? He left God's presence, came here temporarily, and went back. Right? So while Moses is a foreshadow of Jesus, Jesus is the better version of that, right? Because he kind of does the same thing, but in reverse. He comes from God's presence temporarily and then returns, whereas Moses does it the other way around, right? But even the time Moses spends in God's presence affects him, you remember, with the glowing and whatnot. Yes, sir.
I was just going to make a point about the angels. I thought it was interesting when it tells them what this God will do, that he will protect you against the other nations. All right. You think about that. One angel, he sent one angel who could do that. And then you make that comparison to Jesus in the garden when he's about to be taken and he said, don't you know that I could pray to my Father and he would send me 12 legions of angels?
Yeah.
With when you see what one angel is capable of doing, and in fact, we think it just seems that one angel went through Egypt and killed all the firstborn.
Could happen. Yeah, it is always singular, I
It's
think, in
singular,
Egypt.
right? Yeah, when you think about what one angel could do, and then you say Jesus had the ability to call forth legions of those angels if he chose it to.
Yeah.
You see,
He could summon them all is terrifying power. Again, when you see in the text blood being sprinkled, that should set off positive alarm bells in your head, right? Because over and over and over, that same language is used to describe what Jesus would do, right? Jesus would be the atonement. He would be the sprinkled blood that purifies and brings us into union with God. All of those sorts of ideas tie together with Jesus, specifically to that end. I like the way 1 Peter begins, 1 Peter 1, the first couple of verses. Just listen to the ideas in comparison to what we've read. Peter says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to all who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. Right? So at the very least, Peter ties together obeying and sprinkling with blood, ideas we saw in our text here. The Israelites were sprinkled with the blood of the covenant. They were told to obey not only God, but this angel that he would send. Right? All those ideas sort of dovetail together. When you think about the idea of someone bringing a people to their promised land and defending them on the way, that's Jesus all over again, right? That's the same storyline that Jesus is going to ultimately fulfill for all of us. And then there's this. Remember Mark chapter, this is one of those, you don't realize it until you see it. Mark chapter 2, you remember Jesus and his disciples are going through the grain fields and they're eating grain kind of on the side. And the Pharisees throw a fit because, well, look, you're working on this, you're doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath. Jesus gives two reasons. Number one, and I'm paraphrasing here, you weren't upset with David when he did his thing, okay? When he was on the run from Saul and he stopped in with the priest and got the bread of the presence. You weren't upset about that. But then the second reason, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now, I'll admit, you kind of go around and around with that. And then you reread Exodus 23. What's the reason given in Exodus 23 for the Sabbath? What does it center on? It centers on taking care of people, right? Because who rests on the Sabbath? Well, the slave, the animal, the land. Everybody gets a break on the Sabbath. Now, there are other reasons for the Sabbath. Exodus gives you the creation. Deuteronomy gives you the Exodus itself. But the reason given in Exodus 23 is very centered on them. The Sabbath was given to Israel for their sake, for their rest and refreshment and betterment. What are they doing in Mark chapter 2? They're eating. They're trying to regain some strength. They're not out harvesting the wheat. They're just trying to, refresh themselves. Jesus found it appropriate to let them do that on that day. And I like that the reason he gave was the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was never meant to be, oppressive on them. It was always supposed to be for them. And the Jews by Jesus' time had missed the point. Of course, he gets to be Lord of the Sabbath too, so even he gets to decide what they do on that day. But I find that this text in Exodus gives me a better explanation of that idea with Jesus. Also, throughout the Bible, there are these references in Scripture to a covenant meal happening again. This doesn't happen again, really. As far as I know in their history, they don't have this same sort of meal, at least in the way it was had at Mount Sinai. You could say that some of the sacrifices had an eating aspect to it, and there was a feast that would go on there. But this whole, we're going to gather God's people together and have a feast. Remember what it says in Isaiah 25? On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. He will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. He's not talking about what Israel's going to get when they come back from exile. He's pointing forward to something better, some greater fulfillment of what happened here in our text. Whatever happened at Sinai, something greater would happen with the Messiah, with Jesus. There would be a greater covenant meal where God would enter into covenant really not just with Israel, but with any who would come to him in faith. They would be able to gather and assemble and have that sort of idea with this. So anyway, I thought it was an interesting thought. Okay, application stuff. For you and I today, again, you get more examples in the text of love your neighbor as yourself, right? I mean, you can kind of read through this and go, okay, every single thing they're told to do with other people, what does it boil down to? And you can really just do this with every single one of them. Why weren't they allowed to oppress sojourners or let their enemy's ox run away or force their slaves to work on the Sabbath? Well, that could be love your God too. But all of these, they have to do with one thing, and it's loving your neighbor as yourself, right? That law comes later, but the principle of it's already here. Yeah.
And what I thought of, we kind of like talked around it a little bit at the beginning of chapter 23, is he really is saying all of the details of like, don't use the power you might have to gain against someone else. Like, you know, if it's you and someone of lesser, like someone who has a less economic status in court, like you are not allowed to use what you have to oppress him. And so it's kind of just like the wordier, more exampled way of saying, like, you still have to be equal even if you have different things from them.
Yeah, here's what it looks like. And it's fascinating that God accounts for something that you wouldn't think you'd have to say. Well, you think you would have to say, yeah, make sure the people with all the money don't oppress the people without the money. That's, I think, we would get that. But God even comes back and says, make sure you don't just arbitrarily judge or decide the case for the poor man because he's poor. Right? Like, how often do you think that happens? It might, depending on the situation, right? Guy, steals a bunch of stuff. Well, he's, he can, We start thinking about situations and we start thinking about truth, right? God's worried about truth. Mark?
We have the same in our own legal system. You hear cases where juries award huge sums of money to somebody because they don't like what somebody else was doing, and you hear cases where some fellow won $8 or $10, $12 million, in judgment on some small matter they interview jury people and say, well, he seemed like he was in a bad way, or they felt sorry for him, and so they increased the amount.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it can happen. It happens even in our legal system on occasion.
I think were this series of laws given to, Americans in the 1800s, maybe even the late 1900s, early 1900s, you would have had to thrown in, make sure you don't decide cases for people because they're white. Make sure you don't judge this way because a person's black or not. It's the same principle, right? It's not about these other factors that we try to make the thing. It's about justice and truth being done. And the other variables can't be allowed to sway that. That makes sense? Yep.
A slightly different way of looking at what you're saying is, when you look at all the law here, when you boil it down to love God, and your neighbor as yourself, we like in our culture to keep our religion at a high level like that. But God,
Some do.
you know, the big stuff, the high level stuff.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
You know, but, you know, people like that. But God here goes, what do you mean by that, God? Well, let me tell you. And so really what we're reading here are God breaking that down into details to say, when I say that, here's what I mean. You know, so I heard what you said, God, but what do you mean by that? What do you mean with that law? Here, God is laying that out for you in detail so that you can understand what he means by that.
That's it. I put this on here too. This was the point Mike brought up earlier. 23, 4-5 looks just like Matthew 5 from the Sermon on the Mount, right? Where you're treating your enemies appropriately. This I thought was, this wasn't my point, but I found it and I really liked it. Israel was supposed to be distinct from the nations around them. Why? What would make them Israelite? What was supposed to make them Israelite? They listened to and obeyed Yahweh. That was it. That's what it meant to be an Israelite. For a Christian, the requirement's the same. What is to be our distinction from the world? We listen to God and do what he says. Right? It's not a color thing. It's not an economic status thing. Those things are, immaterial. That's our means of isolation from the world. Right? We listen to God, we do what he says. And we have that in common with Israel. I saw another wave. Yes, sir.
I want to back you up to the applications of Jesus and ask you. At the end of 24, it talks about Moses going up on the mountain or in the cloud for 40 days and 40 nights. And obviously, you think of Jesus when he was tempted 40 days and 40 nights. The devil takes him to a high mountain during that temptation. And just thought that was an interesting comparison between the two. But I wanted to ask you, is there something with 40 days and 40 nights that I don't understand? Because you think about the flood was 40 days and 40 nights. And then these two instances, I don't know, maybe there's some more in the Bible that I don't know about, but is there a significance to that I don't understand here?
In this text, I'm not sure.
Jesus, 40 days and 40 nights.
Right.
40 years in the wilderness.
It's sort of a complete round number, you might say. But why this one was 40 days, I actually don't know. What was weird to me about the end of 24, and this is one of those, it happened this way, but like why is the question, right? The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai. The cloud covered it 6 days. On the seventh day, he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. But 15 says he went up on the mountain. So was he up there a week and then 40 days? Is 40 days including I don't know. I don't know what it meant. I think that's how it happened, because the guy it happened to wrote this text. But I don't know. We don't get all the details there. The appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Can you think of another instance in which Moses and a mountain and a devouring fire are listed together? The burning bush. And this is even the same place. Israel's having their burning bush moment, you might say, where the mountain just burns continually, all the time, for well over a month. The mountain's not consumed, right? They're getting that right there. I can't imagine. And I'm not going to talk about the thing Brad's going to talk about because he's worked on that. So I'm going to let him do that. There's a neat. Anyway, we could go on. Again, I mentioned this last week, and again, it bears repeating. Christians are still concerned about vulnerable people. Okay, it's best that's done individually in terms of the vulnerable people in our lives. In terms of brethren, that's done, by the collective, by the church. That is the way that's supposed to be taken care of. We don't want to lose our concern for vulnerable people because we're in a nation that has way more safety nets than they could have ever even thought of, right? People still need help. Yep.
I have heard people say before that, we have to be Christians not just on Sunday. They had to be Jews not just on Saturday.
Yep.
There wasn't a whole lot of this that had to do with, there will be later, but what you do when you quote unquote worship. There was a whole lot of it that was just about how you went about day to day. You're not worshiping God when you see your neighbor's donkey. That's just life.
Yep. Their whole life is supposed to be tied up in this service idea. Okay, let's think about 25. Now, this one's different. We're going to do 3 chapters because there's a lot there, but there's a lot of stuff I'm not going to go into super good. If you're looking for an explanation as to why there were so many curtain rings, you have to find it somewhere else, because I got nothing for you. But we're going to go through as much of this as we can, 25 to 27, Lord willing, next week. And then we'll have a few more chapters of that, and then we'll get to 32 hopefully soon. But next week, those 3 chapters, that's the idea.